That was the week for December the 31st, 2021. For some of you, it's already January the 1st, 2022. For those of you, Happy New Year. And for the rest of you, Keith, that was the year 2021. Keith's editorial, as always, blames me. He said he didn't want to do a show this week, but only because of my insistence, as if I had any control over Keith. He only ever does anything if he wants to. And in this newsletter, it's actually a really good one, I think, Keith. Congratulations. You make some predictions, some hot, some cold, some ambivalent on 2022. So let's start with your surprise predictions on the venture business. We spent a lot of time talking about venture this year. You've started your own venture capital style startup. So this is a subject that you've given a lot of thought to. What's going to happen with venture capital in 2022, Keith?
Well, let's leave this on the screen while we talk, which means they won't get to see our pretty faces, but that's okay. So the first, the biggest theme we've talked about this year is that venture capital is not a single thing. It's three separate asset classes. We call them seed, venture, and growth. And we've made the point that the venture in the middle is being threatened because the very large check writing growth investors are coming earlier and earlier into companies at the A round stage, sometimes even at the seed stage, rarely, but it does happen. And that means that there's really a reduction down to two asset classes. So my first prediction is that trend will continue to the point where there really won't be such a thing as venture capital. There'll be seed capital and growth capital. And most companies will die before they get to the growth stage. Today, it's about 70 to 80% of companies never get to an A round from a seed. But those that do manage to get there will attract very large amounts of capital very quickly and grow in value very quickly.
And in what sense, Keith, is this different from any other industry that digital has revolutionized? Media, for example, automotive, finance, banking, that is. I mean, the disappearance of the middle, a winner-take-all economy in which a handful of players dominate everything, two or three companies at most, and then a huge kind of underclass. Why is venture capital in any way different? What does it tell us that the other industries don't?
Actually, it's different in one important regard, which is that the seed, which is, you could think of it as the small funds, are growing enormously, both in terms of the number of funds and in terms of the amount of money.
At what point? I've never understood. Everyone claims to be a VC. All you need to do is put $300 into your neighbor's startup and you're already a venture capitalist. You're a seed investor. At what point do we need to draw a line under people who are just investing in friends or family innovation?
Well, a venture capitalist by definition is managing other people's money, not their own. Okay. They put a bit of their own in. So they've raised a fund from third parties. And, there's language. It's all very gray, this language, but it's if you're managing under 100 million in a single fund, you're characterized as a micro VC, which is the seed stage, really. Before that, you're a super angel, and then you're probably investing your own money.
Yeah.
And that's the distinction.
So I interrupted you to go back to this distinction of what venture teaches us that other industries aren't.
Well, the biggest thing it teaches us, and I don't really think about how it compares to other industries, so you're making me think, but I do think about how it evolves within itself, and how it is evolving within itself is it's becoming bigger by far. If you look at the total dollars invested in venture in 2021, it's the largest ever, and it's going to grow again in 2022. That's a function of a couple of things. One is macroeconomics, where interest rates are low and money seeks yield. That is to say, money wants to turn into more money, and venture is becoming more and more attractive as a vehicle for that. It's only one asset class, but it's a growing one. And then secondly, the accelerated growth of unicorns and decacorns means that depending on how you invest, you can do very, very well, very, very quickly. And that's compounded by the fact that IPOs are declining, and most companies grow their valuation while still private. So you can't wait for a company to become public and then invest in it and then hope to get very large returns as easily as you could in the past. Investing privately is as long as you know what you're doing, is a better way of achieving that.
How does the death of the middle market happen? Is it after a significant economic crash that may well happen in 2022? I'm not asking you to predict that, because that's obviously impossible, but there's certainly a possibility.
Well, I don't think it's possible for this to collapse because it's driven by actual innovation and very large amounts of revenue.
When you say this to collapse, what are you talking about?
The growth of venture in total.
Mm.
And I don't think the middle can survive because people like Tiger Global have changed the rules.
So who is the middle? Is it Draper Fisher? Is it Sequoia?
Sequoia is trying to become a growth investor and a seed investor, which is what all the big guys will do. They'll try to be both.
Is that the kiss of death? They got to do one or the other?
No, they can do both, but it's different people doing it, and different rules apply. But the middle is really people like Spark, True Ventures, Draper Fisher for sure. Kleiner Perkins used to be in the middle. They're trying very hard to become a growth investor. Mary Meeker left Kleiner to form Bond Capital, which is a growth investor.
And when you say growth investor, what that means is that you invest larger amounts of money, but
later
it's a less radical, less dangerous bet. So
it's a less dangerous bet, and you write bigger checks. So yeah, the absolute dollars you produce are huge, but the multiple of the capital you've invested is lower.
And what about Union Square? There was a good piece by Albert Wenger we'll talk about later. Are they in the middle here as well, or are they still at the lower end?
They're really a very professional seed investor that continues to invest in their companies through the middle, but they're really a trendsetter. They look for themes. Their current theme is Web3, which is a simplified version of their narrative. They actually published their theme. And you know, they are believers in what happens next, and they put money behind that. So they're closer to a seed investor in terms of style, and they're not threatened because they're good at being specialist.
And is your startup, it's a seed play, right? You're sort of a meta seed play in a sense, or you're riding on seed.
Well, my startup recognizes that the best companies that get seed funding grow very fast now, and that the seed investors typically don't have enough capital to keep investing in those companies. So my startup it's a fintech company providing capital to seed investors in order to enable them to meet the challenges.
You're greasing the wheels of the seed economy, or the seed investment economy.
Greasing the wheels probably implies an earlier. We typically put money in when a company reaches a Series B. And that Series B is when the seed fund is most challenged to be able to write the check required to keep its shares in the company.
Isn't it kind of ironic, Keith, that on the one hand, you're predicting the collapse of this middle market, and on the other hand, your startup is designed to help seed companies grow so that they can get to the middle market, which you say is dying?
Well, it really is. It's what it's really doing. I understand why you say that, and that is a possible interpretation of what I'm doing. But the way I think of it is, what we're doing is we are doubling down on the seed asset class, which is a survivor and growing and prospering, and helping it thrive by providing capital longer into the life of a company. We actually focus on the B, the C, and the D round, and helping the seed investor maintain their shares through those rounds. Easily and simply, we automate the whole thing. So I think we're helping kill the middle and helping the seed stage survive and prosper.
And finally, Keith, on these venture predictions, we really should credit the great Genet Tier for all this. This is where you get your intelligence from, isn't it?
Of course. Genet is... you know, the nice thing about being married to Genet is that we both have to think about what's going on in venture. So, we talk about these things a lot.
Yeah, how many couples discuss the venture industry over breakfast or in bed? Well, we'll have to do a Lennon, a Yoko Ono style thing from your bedroom one day, Keith, with a discussion with you and Janae talking about venture capital. It's not just the venture business though that you're predicting. You're also, and I'm not even convinced there's a term. I don't really understand what this term means, but you're much more bullish on this, the creator economy. I don't know what it means, but you believe it could be an important thing in 2022.
Yeah, I think the creator economy is a kind of a hand-me-down phrase to describe a whole bunch of things. The most important is the growth of relatively inexpensive and sometimes free tools that enable an individual or a group of individuals to act like a major TV or radio network. So if you look at things like Twitter Spaces and Clubhouse, you can do dial-in radio with audience participation for nothing. And so suddenly, all of the tools that normally would be expensive or only used by professionals can now be used by everyone.
So how is this? I just did a show on my Keenon podcast with somebody who's doing Substack. Andrew Sullivan's already doing this on Substack.
Well, Sullivan writes. So think of Sullivan as mainly a writer. If you add in, Kara Swisher is probably the best example of the most fully formed version of this. Kara writes. She also does events. She does video. She does a Twitter Spaces with Casey Newton every Monday to a live audience discussing, whatever preoccupies her. She has the podcast with Scott Galloway. So she's a multifaceted individual with lots of outlets. Her reputation and influence has grown massively in 2021, but she's still paid a salary. Now, Sam Lessin, the venture capitalist from Slow Ventures, who's married to Jessica Lessin, who runs The Information, Sam Lessin made his first investment this year in an individual by giving them millions of dollars in return for a share of their revenue over 30 years.
And who was that?
It's a woman creator, and I forget her name. I apologize to her. We'll put it in the
kind of return to. It's a very creepy idea, isn't it? A return to feudalism. Why should Sam Lessig own? What is she? A musician, a writer?
No, she's a podcaster, and it's a little bit like Bruce Springsteen just sold his back catalog for $500 million for the future revenue it might produce. So there is a known thing in media of buying future revenue, and the venture capital version of that is buying the future revenue of well-known creators. So somebody could come to you, Andrew, and say, Andrew Keen, I think during the next 20 years, you're going to build an empire using all these new tools, and Andrew Keen's brand is going to grow, and eventually you're going to be making 30 or 40 million a year, which translates into a enterprise value of $300 or $400 million annually. Let me buy a piece of that now for 10 million. And you do a deal, and you've kind of given fractional ownership of your future income to some investor.
Yeah, I'm curious on the Lessig deal of not Lessin, not Lessig. That was a Freudian error. Lessin deal in terms of the artist or whoever it was, because it sounds very problematic. I mean, they become a manager essentially with an investment. I mean, you and I just watched the Beatles documentary, the Peter Jackson Beatles documentary. Nothing much has changed. I mean, even back then, McCartney and Harrison were arguing about whether to do albums or television shows. What's changed over the last 50 years?
Well, what's changed is the availability of access to a large audience. It was always really hard to get access to a large audience, and you needed middlemen, distributors, and so on, promoters, advertising, radio stations to play your music.
But even you mentioned Kara. Kara still has middlemen. She has the New York Times in particular. I mean, she doesn't need that income from the Times. She chooses to use it.
Well, that's why she's a good example, because she is behind the times when it comes to who owns her output, and she's ahead of the times in terms of how she produces the output and gets an audience. And the prediction is someone like her, not necessarily her, but someone like her this year will accept a reasonable sized check from an investor to own their output, as well as be able to use the tools. And that will be one of the first, well-known. It could be Brian Matthews, who just left MSNBC. Who knows? But somebody's going to accept investment for their future product, and put enough money in the bank to actually make that a good product.
That'll be interesting. We will see. So Keith has predicted that there will be a prominent media personality who will accept investment in their brand. So we'll see this time next year. Keith, by this time next year, my prediction is Web3 will be a bigger subject. It's still a bit of an inside the Beltway term. What's your prediction on Web3?
The main prediction on Web3 is that it will fail to meet the hype for another 12 months.
Surprise, surprise, which is...
That said, there's some micro predictions within it. I think Bitcoin will go over $100,000 at some point during the year. It's currently at 40 something, 47,000. I think Web3 projects will mainly be in fintech. So banking and interest-bearing accounts and stuff like that will be focused on, but largely centralized, not truly decentralized for the most part. I do think that developers and engineers are where the action really is in Web3. That is to say, really, really smart people are.
So it's the plumbing that's still being built, essentially, for Web3.
Yeah, exactly. And there will, and I say there'll be no killer app. The way you would know that is suddenly you'd stop using Amazon for buying stuff, or Uber for cars, or Facebook for sharing, or Twitter for publishing and broadcasting. I don't think any of those things are going to fall into misuse this year. But if you're a developer doing Web3, your end game should be to replace one or more of those.
I would see of all the Amazon, put that thing back up, Amazon, Facebook, when you talk about Amazon, Uber, Facebook, Twitter, other centralized Web2 infrastructures, the type that's most vulnerable is Uber. Because I think we've had this conversation before. To me, Uber is profoundly in danger. You've got all these drivers who can work together. You've got customers who don't care. All they want to do is get from A to B or get food. Knocking out the middlemen in Uber seems, or Uber-style businesses seems the easiest. Doesn't make it easy. But
a way to say what you're saying that's generic is, if you're a marketplace company, that is to say you're in the middle between suppliers and buyers, the thinner your market, the more vulnerable you are to a decentralized version of it.
So Amazon also then is vulnerable, given how important the resellers are on their platform.
Absolutely could be. The Amazon warehouses and the Amazon fulfillment and the trucks they're buying from Rivian are all moats that protect Amazon, because it's, you would, but you can already imagine how you might write tech to create the equivalent of that without there being an Amazon.
And then you'll say there's no DAOs that will provide a living income. What will be the best known DAO, the most viable DAO at the end of next year, do you think?
I think it's probably going to be related to stable coins and interest rates. So it might be the universe around the Luna organization, which does a stable coin called UDT. It could be Circle with USDC and some of the things that it's working on with Jeremy Allaire. Hard to know exactly. It could be related to NFTs. NFTs are definitely becoming mainstream, and the ability to tag a digital asset in terms of who owns it And for that to be enforceable and knowable means that more and more people with assets are trying to cash in on them. Even CNN made NFTs this year, and NFTs sitting on top of DAOs where there's rules. That's going to be a growing space. None of these things are going to fail or die. It's just that the stage of their evolution is maybe 1 or 2 steps short from the killer app.
And then you got a zinger at the end, Keith. And you've also got your own section on AI. You say AI will neither be artificial nor intelligent, and no general AI will be launched. I don't even understand what a general AI is.
A general AI is the words used to describe a self-learning AI that grows in knowledge and intelligence all by itself.
Well, that's the apocalypse for us as a species, isn't it?
And able to turn itself to any problem. So if you think about that, the AI developed at Google by the British company they acquired that could play Go and win at Go.
Yeah.
Being able to win at Go didn't allow that computer to win at any other game. It was very specialist. A general AI, it could just learn games.
What about OpenAI? Any predictions on that? Is that going to continue to make a lot of promises and do nothing?
I think Sam Altman is really, deeply invested in that, and I do think that has an impact because he's going to be able to invest large amounts of time and resources and pull clever people together. But OpenAI more describes access to the algorithms and the learning methods, and the Web3 gives the hardware and software needed to scale that. So yeah, that's going to grow and get better. It's just that these days, for someone inside the industry, I describe what's going on today as it's machine learning. It's sometimes not even machine learning. Sometimes it's rules-based data processing. So that we're far away from what the true meaning of AI is.
Yeah, and I don't think anyone would disagree, and certainly not going to change in a year. You do also make a rather depressing, at least from some people's point of view, prediction on SPACs. You said they're not going to recover in 2022. So you used to be a SPAC man, Keith. What happened? All we ever used to hear about earlier in this year was SPACs, and then you conveniently forgot about them.
Yeah, I tagged them on the end of this venture capital one because I think that's the appropriate context for SPACs. SPACs are a way for growth stage venture capitalists to get liquidity on investments they previously made, or they're a way for people with no money but access to money to get ownership, up to 20% ownership in companies, by offering them to go public via a SPAC. And so there's a lot of scams. And basically what has happened is the underlying logic of a SPAC, which is that people will put money in today for a business model that's going to be good in 2025, fell apart. The money wasn't there to bet on what might happen in 2025. So the SPACs typically can't find a candidate and get the valuation they want.
How does this fit into your narrative on the collapse of the middle? Were SPACs trying to replace the middle?
Well, it's hard to reduce SPACs down to a single set of incentives, but certainly one of the drivers, for example, Coastal Ventures started a bunch of SPACs, and they were mainly designed for their own investments to go public. So one of the drivers was venture firms threatened by the growth investors wanting to retain ownership and choosing a public listing for a company that isn't really ready for a public listing through a SPAC. And that kind of works, did work in the first half of 2021, and then it ground to a halt. So
did anyone lose their shirt on SPACs, or was it just a sort of media frenzy and ultimately a non-event?
Some people lost a lot of money.
What about that unpronounceable guy's name who made a lot of money and was Mr. SPAC for a while?
Chamath almost certainly made money through SPACs, but he had some bad outcomes as well.
And who is the big loser? Is there any individual in particular who made a complete fool of themselves with SPACs?
I think the biggest loser is the SPAC organizers, because they they have 2 years to consummate a merger with a company and go public, and they have to pay the money back plus interest if they fail. So there's a lot of SPAC organizers sitting on money, failing to find a merger, who are going to have to pay the money back.
And there were a lot of, we noted this earlier, a lot of people who shouldn't have been involved in this with starting their own SPACs. Wasn't there some politicians, people who clearly knew nothing about the market or tech?
That's definitely true. I will say this, though. I still believe the SPAC as an instrument is an incredibly good tool for a certain type of company. And I do think at some point the market that wants to put institutional money into future winners, the SPAC will prove to be a good way of doing that for companies that need lots of capital expenditure in order to get big, for example, and need more time. So if you're building like Elon Musk's tunnels with trains running to LA through tunnels, needs a massive amount of capital and won't pay off for maybe 20 or 30 years.
And they're kind of a replacement for the state in some way. Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things I've learned from tech is that when something fails, it usually comes back because there's usually good reason for something in the first place, and it takes 2 or 3 tries for something to work. You're also suggesting, Keith, that regulation isn't going to happen in 2022. Your old friend Lena Khan, that woman who published her student paper, much to your annoyance, you said she seems to have disappeared, and the whole regulation thing seems to have sort of gone out of the news. I'm not sure why.
Well, I think there's a couple of reasons. The first is that the canvas is shifting away from social media.
Yeah.
And so as that happens, the fear of owning social media reduces in society. Facebook's been quite clever in defining the metaverse and kind of distracting everybody from what it does today. And along with that, we've seen the rise of Web3. We've seen, Jack Dorsey leave Twitter and change the name of Square to The Block. So there's a whole new set of emerging technologies where the focus is now, clearly shining.
Yeah, and I also think that the political crisis that's engulfed the Biden regime has meant that they're not focusing on anything except the most important stuff: COVID, and some of the bills, and the tech stuff that they led with, or some of them led with at the beginning of the year, has just disappeared. It's just no longer interesting politically.
Yeah, well, you could conclude that politicians are only able to get so much done. In the case of Biden, truthfully, not very much at all. And
you're being kind.
Yeah. So it really is more of a statement about political systems not being capable of rising to the needs of the moment, and that's a deeper conversation. We all love democracy, but we all hate bureaucracy. And it seems like the two belong together right now, and it's a mess. And it means that if you are an innovator, for the most part, you don't need to fear government because they're too slow and cumbersome.
Well, let's go outside America finally, Keith, for your predictions on globalization and China. You got a couple of interesting thoughts on the fate of globalization in 2022 and the direction of the Chinese economy, particularly its tech economy.
Yeah, China remains fascinating. I read a newsletter called, I think it's called Cynicism, which looks like cynicism when you read it. And the guy is Chinese who writes it, and he has translated the results of the latest Communist Party Congress, where they redefined Chinese history, to be, aligned with China becoming the world's leading capitalist nation. And it's fascinating stuff, and it impacts the whole world. And that's part of globalization. And I predict that Chinese electric vehicles from 3 companies will start to be sold in Europe this year, and probably America next year in 2023. And China is coming, and that's globalization. But actually,
But that doesn't require a genius that China is coming, Keith. Surely.
Yeah. Well, then I make a different point, and I learned this through reading. I didn't make this language up, but it kind of hit me when I read it that it's really important. Is the distinction between cross-border economics, which obviously are everywhere and growing, and transnational infrastructures, which are not national at all. So it doesn't represent the growth of a nation onto the globe. It represents the replacement of nations with transnational infrastructure. That, it feels to me, is what in 2022 we need to focus on. What those transnational infrastructures that nation states can't and don't control, and where a larger and larger measured in dollars, a larger and larger amount of money is flowing through these transnational structures outside of the 16th century economy that we live in the nation state driven world.
And finally, China. What's going to happen? You say they become self-sufficient in chips. Is that a big deal?
I think it's a huge deal. China has always been thought of a little bit like Korea was after the Second World War, or Japan for that matter, as not a place where things are invented, but a place that assembles and puts stuff together and then sells it to the rest of the world. That's changing. China is going to become a place that invents and exports, and therefore will not be dependent on, Broadcom, for example, for its chips, or other American
But
corporations.
so what?
Well, it means that its growth is unconstrained by supply issues, and politics can't stop them.
Interesting. Well, you haven't made any predictions, and maybe we'll talk about this in 2022 of the fate of the dollar and other international economic issues. So there's lots to talk about in 2022. My only prediction is that was the week will continue for all of 2022, and that we will have a similar conversation this time next year. We are at our favorite bit of the show, my favorite bit of the show, two bits, startup of the week and tweet of the week. What's your startup of the week, Keith, this week?
My startup of the week actually is AngelList. AngelList has been around a long time, and I will admit, if Naval ever listens to this, Naval, I have on occasion been a critic of AngelList, as in I didn't necessarily think the part of the market it addressed was a very interesting part of the market. That said, AngelList has transformed itself recently into becoming a software-driven organizer of both investors and startups. And it now has created an algorithmic fund, in only 25 million to start with, which is close to my heart because I'm also doing algorithmic capital allocation. But it's using the signal of hiring cadence. So if you're hiring fast, that is a signal that you're doing something right. And,
well, you could also argue, you and I are both veterans of startups, you're doing something wrong. If you're hiring fast, often it's a indicator you're going to go bust fast too.
Interesting you should say that, Andrew, because that is my point of view. I think hiring...
That's why you haven't hired me.
Or anyone else that's listening. and the truth is, hiring is a false positive signal of success. And what you really try to do with algorithms is find... you're really trying to reduce false positives down as close to zero as you can, even at the expense of missing some good opportunities. You'd rather miss some good opportunities than have lots of bad companies.
And if you hire a lot of people, doesn't that indicate that you've got money, so you don't actually need investment?
Well, no, usually in startup land, it works the other way. You hire fast, your burn rate goes up, and your cash out date gets closer and closer, and you need to do your next round. Thomas Tungers, who we've talked about on this show a lot, from Redpoint, wrote an article this week about mark-to-market investment rounds, by which he means you do a funding round even when you don't need money, just because the market's prepared to give it to you and your peers are doing it. So if you don't raise money, you're going to fall behind in terms of the cash on your balance sheet to be able to win.
And that's always the sort of the Jason Calacanis excuse for raising as much money as you possibly can, even though you don't have a particularly coherent business idea.
Yeah, that happens a lot. But I think for companies that do have a coherent business idea, it's never. As a person that's always formed corporations, the biggest argument against this is you get diluted. I've never bought that. I think dilution for a founder is a good thing. At the end of the day, if you build a big company, the difference between you owning 10% of it at fruition versus, let's say, 15% is just how rich you get. And it's better to take the risk off and be less rich than to keep the risk and run out of money. So
I think the best wisdom is the Reid Hoffman line: fail fast, rather than you more people you hire. I guess if you employ a lot of people, that means you will fail fast because you'll run out of money. Finally, Keith, tweet of the week, which I have to admit I have no understanding of. I usually have some understanding of these tweets, but this one was completely mystifying. What does it mean?
So this is a guy called Marty Bent pointing to a YouTube video by the expert in the distributed protocol for Web3 that Jack Dorsey is keen on and helping fund. So this video, which is quite long, is for those with the tolerance to get into the weeds of what Web3 is all about. This is the guru who actually understands it and is building it, talking about in context what is being built and why and how it will work. So I put it in there more as a reference. It's like the Encyclopedia Britannica of Web3 tweet of the week.
And I would suggest finally that if anyone really wants to read something wise and coherent on Web3, they read the Albert Wenger piece that Fred Wilson cites in one of the articles that in the newsletter this week. The fact that Albert Wenger is still writing positively about Web3, I think, says something about its long-term viability.
Yep. Yeah. Well, Albert is one of those people that really understands transnational infrastructures as it relates to what humans do and how money flows according to that. So for him, Web3 is, he understands the end game. So because he understands the end game, he sees the steps towards it as they happen. He's very good.
Well, Keith, you've been very good for 2021. We will see how your predictions are for 22. Happy New Year to you and all our listeners. And we will talk again this time next week in January 2022.
Bye, Andrew. Bye, everyone.
Bye.